Okay, greetings, everyone. We're going to get started. This is Eric Hauge, Executive Director at Homeline, and you are joining us on Wednesday, April 14th at 1:30 in the afternoon for another one of our regular webinars on Minnesota tenant landlord issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been doing these for a year now. We started in mid-April of last year and have kept this up for a year now, I think. We'll continue to do so for the foreseeable future. We have a number of things to go over really quick before we get to our first guest speaker. We are joined by Sarah Lewis, who's a program coordinator from Legalcore, and is going to share with us some information about clinics for legal clinics for advice clinics for landlords who income qualify. Since we get a lot of questions on these regular webinars from landlords, we wanted to share this resource. So before we get started, just some brief introductory comments. Here we go. Just a reminder about what Homeline is. We're a statewide nonprofit organization. We've been around since the early 90s and have advised over 260,000 renter households. That's our main program, is a free and confidential legal hotline for renters to get individualized advice about their situation. And we advise folks in English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong languages. That is our tenant hotline number in the Metro and Greater Minnesota, as well as we do have language specific lines that are available there. And you can submit a question to one of our attorneys on our website as well. Just wanted to give a heads up. We did take a sort of a 3-week hiatus, but we will be returning in 2 weeks on April 28th. The Wednesday, April 28th, again at 1:30 to 3 in the afternoon. And we're excited about this seminar. And I think Mike, our managing attorney and hotline director, might talk a little bit more about it later in the session. But we're going to be joined by Homeline staff, Andrea Palumbo, housing attorney at Homeline, and Leah DeGrazia, who is a SAIC's public interest, I may have pronounced that wrong, public interest resident through the U of M Law School. And we had them on, I want to say it was in October of last year, and they ran some numbers on the numbers of evictions that were filed throughout the state during the pandemic under the suspensions, and just sort of ran some did some research into the types of cases and the numbers throughout the state. And so this now that we're beyond a full year of the suspension being in place, it was put into place in late March of 2020. They have taken a full year's worth of data on these evictions and are going to be delving into the details of that. We are applying for 1.5 CLE credits for attorneys, and we welcome you to join us. I will put a link in the chat about where you can register, but you can also go to our website, as we have a lot of materials and information, FAQs about the pandemic, eviction suspensions, and other related topics on our website. So today we promised you a review, since it's been a few weeks, of what's going on with the eviction suspension, both on a federal level and a state level, and also any updates about rental assistance. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. Mike Vraw, managing attorney and hotline director for Homeline, will be joining us to share some of those details and go through a presentation. And we'll also have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of the session. We did get quite a few in advance, maybe 15 or 20. So we'll take any sort of legal questions about the suspension and other related topics at the end, and welcome to field them throughout if you want to submit them via the Q&A system over Zoom or in the chat. But in the meantime, we do have a guest speaker on today. Sarah Lewis with LegalCore is with us, and I'm going to hand it over to her. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, we get a lot of questions. We have a wide variety of audience members on these sessions, a lot of tenants and landlords and attorneys and service providers and government staff, but get a lot of questions almost every week from landlords about their legal situations. And so Sarah's going to share with us about what Legalcore does and about some resources that might be available for those of you. Thanks, Sarah.
You're welcome. Thank you, Eric, and thank you for having me. Thanks to Homeline for agreeing to let me pop into the beginning of this webinar. I am just going to speak no more than 10 minutes, maybe try to keep it around 5, and then exit myself right out of here so you can get to the substance of the presentation and get your questions out there. So I'm just going to give you a little background about Legalcore and our services primarily so that you have that sort of base knowledge, and then tell you about our new initiative that we've recently piloted just a few weeks ago that is directed at assisting low-income residential landlords. And I do have a couple slides. Of the first few are just information on our services. I'll tell you briefly. Legalcore is a small nonprofit organization, very similar to Homeline in that respect, probably even a little smaller, been around since 2004. And we coordinate pro bono legal services for primarily low-income entrepreneurs, small business owners, inventors, and low-revenue nonprofit organizations. We have a roster of approximately 500 attorneys who practice transactional business law and intellectual property law, who are donating their time to counsel and assist our clients. And the mission of our organization is primarily to expand access to the legal system to those who might otherwise be left out. We have 3 primary modes of service delivery: brief advice clinics, full representation assistance, and educational workshops. What I'm going to focus on primarily today are the brief advice clinics, because that is our new resource that I'm here to talk about. The brief advice clinics are kind of what they sound like. I'm sure it's similar to what one of Homeline services as well, but they are designed to provide guidance to someone starting a new venture, someone who has an existing business or nonprofit. They are staffed by our attorneys. They are available to all and are free of charge. No income screening for those. The questions that come to our attorney volunteers kind of run the gamut of the business law and IP areas. What is an LLC? Do I need business and liability insurance? What is the difference between an employee or an independent contractor? Can I trademark my logo, etc.? The clinics lend themselves to the receipt of some general guidance or asking a couple questions. We also coordinate full representation assistance. I won't go through all the details. It's up there on the screen for you, but that becomes an option when the legal needs of a client cannot be handled in a 30-minute consultation. That type of service does require income eligibility, and as you can see, we follow 200% of the federal poverty guidelines to make that determination. But once a client is deemed eligible and is placed with a volunteer attorney, the attorney's time is free, or as the attorney is providing their services pro bono. We also coordinate educational workshops, our third service delivery model, on particular topics. Those are primarily given community partner organizations who have seen a need for a specific area of legal knowledge within their audience, constituents, communities. So those are our 3 primary modes of service. I think the next slide, Eric, kind of lists some of the types of matters that come our way, and I kind of referenced a few of those. But I won't run through them because you can read them. But those are kind of most of the categories of issues that our attorneys typically handle, both at the brief advice clinic level and in full representation. I will point out that all of our pro bono services are transactional based and not litigation. So if something is already in court, someone's been sued, someone wants to sue, or a matter looks like it's headed that way, that is outside the scope of our services. It's outside of our organizational mission and also outside the expertise of our volunteers, as we have transactional business law attorneys. So that's kind of where we were. We have not, until just recently, provided guidance on residential leases, commercial leases, certainly to small business owners, a review of commercial leases, Sometimes we will recruit attorneys to assist with a renegotiation of terms for a commercial lease and provide counsel on, those matters that I shouldn't say do not, we do now. We did not have volunteers previously that had experience with residential leases or very many housing attorneys. What we came to our attention in the last month or so is that there is a need out there for guidance into, pro bono guidance, and that was not being met, a need for pro bono guidance that was not being met to small landlords, low income, small property landlords who are certainly a form of small business owners, a type of small business owner. So that fit within our services, but we just had not dealt with that issue before. So with some discussion with some other legal service organizations in the metro area and with our board of directors, we decided to proceed with trying to coordinate a clinic for low-income landlords, and we have done so. And so I'm happy to be here today to tell you a little bit about what that looks like. Here's the information. It's new. I think we've had 2 clinics thus far. We had one just 2. We have the next few are up there on the screen. We are going to try to have one on a weekly basis. Those dates aren't quite there, but almost. But the offerings that we have are based on what we have been able to staff, the capacity of our volunteers. And so we have confirmed volunteers for those dates. We're trying to hold them, as you can see, on Wednesdays between 1 and 3. And they provide a low-income landlord, if financially qualified, the opportunity for a 30-minute phone consultation with a landlord side housing attorney. This is new, and we're hoping the way this will work is that you can ask your questions. If you have questions about your rights, you can ask for review of contractual provisions. You can discuss updates in the law that may be coming, that may not be coming, and questions, about how the current state of the eviction moratorium affects you and exceptions and all that. That is our goal with this opportunity. We will schedule more as we see what the demand is like and the capacity of our volunteers to staff them. Last week's clinic did have all 4 slots filled, and next Wednesday, which is a week from today, has 3 of the 4 filled. So we've been pleased with, we were afraid we'd be overwhelmed with demand and requests, and we have not been. So far, so good. If we need, and we're working with as I mentioned, our volunteer roster, I'm working with our roster to kind of feel out and see if we have another couple attorneys who could step into staff shifts if the demand presents itself.
Sarah, can I jump in for a second?
Of course you can, Mike.
First, we got a question submitted in the Q&A. Does Legalcore cover malpractice insurance for volunteer lawyers handling your cases?
That is a great question, and absolutely. All of our volunteers are covered by our malpractice insurance for the type of legal assistance that is within the scope of our mission. And so this would qualify, and the other matters and services that I discussed. So yes, and when I'm done speaking, and I'm about there, I can certainly put, you can see here my email address and phone number, but I will put the LegalCore website in the chat, and I can also link our volunteer form if we have attorneys out there that might be interested in volunteering with us. We would love to speak with you, no matter what type of law you practice, but particularly if you're interested in getting involved in this clinic.
A couple of questions about the clinics you've already held. What sort of questions have you had? I assume you're tracking that sort of thing to see the topics that landlords are asking about.
Yep. My sheets are right over here, Mike. I won't pull them out. I'll see if I can remember off the top of my head. A couple of them had to do with tenants who had vacated but had not either taken their stuff or were behind on rent, and what the avenues of recourse might be. I also, we had a gentleman who was in northwestern Minnesota who had a property under contract for deed that he canceled, and how to handle that. And there was someone, a tenant who was purchasing, paying on the contract for deed that they ended up canceling. And the owner of the property had taken care of the utilities and taxes for however many months. And it is kind of a unique situation. And the counseling attorney is actually continuing discussions with him to try to get him hooked up with some more long-term help. I think I did not mention, and if I did, forgive me, but we are limited to just this brief advice clinic for these type of matters. Our volunteer attorneys and are not going to continue with any evictions proceedings that might need to be filed or that have been filed, because anything, which I know I did mention, any litigation is outside the scope of LegalCORPS services. So at this time, all we can offer is the 30 minutes of brief advice.
You mentioned Northwest Minnesota a second ago. So I assume you cover the entire state. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Okay. I couldn't see that in the materials you had up here, so I wanted to make sure that that was right.
Yep. Well, I should have made that clear. I kind of threw that together last night, Mike, but Legalcore does provide services throughout the state of Minnesota, and we have partnerships with small business development centers and Initiative Foundation and community partner organizations throughout the state for our general, core programming. And this certainly will fall within there as well. I think one of the consultations for next Wednesday is in Houston County. So yep, we're trying to get the word out. I think that's all I've got, unless there are additional questions.
Yep,
you guys think?
Yeah, I have one more. There's another one that's been submitted. Okay. Lisa is asking, what does LegalCorps consider to be a small landlord owner? I think your answer is probably based on the income more than anything.
That's correct. Lisa, we are using the federal poverty guidelines, and 300% of the federal poverty guidelines for the size of an applicant's household to determine eligibility. Because we were trying to limit this clinic to those landlords that did not have the resources to hire legal counsel on their own.
And my last question is about the people you have staffing these appointment sessions with landlords. And you mentioned that they had some housing attorney experience, or they are housing attorneys. I'm not sure exactly what training they would have, I guess.
They are landlord side housing attorneys.
Okay. That's what they do for their career, their living.
That's correct. In private practice. We do have a couple, one person on our board and then another that reached out to us that have done some housing law counseling in the past, who have kind of said, if you need me, let me know. And so we've talked about the idea of conducting a training of some sort if we need to for volunteers who want to get involved with this initiative, who may not have current skills or up to date on the state of the law in this area. So if that becomes desired or necessary, we will certainly do that. Okay. But to answer your question, the folks we have are, yes, practice in the area.
Got it. All right. I think we're going to transition away from Sarah, unless there's any last questions that anybody wanted to ask. Now would be the time to submit them either through the Q&A or the chat. Eric, did you have anything that popped to mind as Sarah was talking?
Her contact info is up on the screen. I just want to make sure you said if there are folks that are interested in volunteering, attorneys that are interested, they should contact you at this contact info. Is that?
Yep, that would be great. And I certainly can put this in the chat as well, or the link to the volunteer form, but going through me is the fastest way.
Sounds good.
I want to wish you well with this program. We always want to see more informed landlords, and that's one way to make that happen. So that's great.
Well, thank you guys for including me in this opportunity to get the word out.
Definitely. And we will, I did put a link to the page on your website about this in the chat. And we will have these slides up with the recording of today's seminar too, so you can review if there's folks that want to review what Sarah had to say and the information she provided. So appreciate you joining us today, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, I guess I'm going to hand it at this point. Again, just a reminder, Mike does have about a 20-minute or maybe more set of presentation and slides to give an overview of the current situation, but we are going to take plenty of time for Q&A. We did, again, get a number of questions in advance that we'll tackle, but if you do have any that come up throughout the presentation today, it's really best if you can send it over the Q&A system in Zoom. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thanks, Eric. And I'm going to replug next session that we have scheduled for April 28th. We did this, as Eric mentioned, about 7 months into the pandemic, where we actually looked at every single eviction that had been filed throughout the state. We had eyes on each filing. And I know that that's what Leah and Andrea are working on now. Whenever there's any spare time and we don't have a lot of calls lined up in our hotline, that's what they're doing. And so this was our most watched webinar. We're on number 48 of these webinars since last year. Eric mentioned that it's been almost a year since we started doing these. And by far, it was the most viewed version of a webinar that we did last year. Well over, somewhere between 500 and 600 people were watching the live version, much less the recorded version later on. So we know it's going to be a big turnout, and it'll be fascinating information analyzing what evictions have looked like for a year in this strangest of years, the pandemic. Okay, let's do the quick update on where we're at. The last time we had a presentation was March 24th. And so we were waiting to hear whether Minnesota would renew its executive orders stopping evictions mostly, along with the CDC order. The federal order was set to expire the end of March. And so now we have new information on both. Let's go to the state version first. Earlier today, Governor Walz and the executive committee, I think is the name, met and declared that there would be yet another extension of the peacetime emergency declaration. The eviction moratorium is tied in time to that declaration, and it has been extended for 30 more days as well. I cannot give you the exact end date in May. We haven't been able to figure that out, and there's kind of a weekend question about when that 30 days would be up. And so it's hard for us to declare the exact day. We know that the Minnesota eviction moratorium will officially end as it's currently in place, but it's sometime in mid-May. Whether that's the 13th or the 17th, it's not exactly sure, but it'll be sometime in mid-May. It has been renewed 13 times already by the governor. And we've talked about this many times before, but there might be somebody joining us for the first time today, not sure. There are exceptions. There are evictions that are fileable in Minnesota, but they are only if they fit into the exceptions built into the governor's executive orders. The one that matters is Executive Order 20-79. Again, if you're looking up executive orders, EO stands for executive order. And these are easy to find online, by the way. You just Google up Minnesota executive orders, and they list them for all time. They only go back so far. But so EO, Executive Order 20 is 2020, and 79. So that was in August of last year. The eviction moratorium has not been altered or amended in any way since August of last year. It is the third version. There was one back in March, and then another one earlier in the summer, and then the latest version that's the one that's still in place right now. And it's been extended through mid-May at this point. Now, the question that we always get is, when is this state moratorium going to end? There's only a few ways it can end. Number one, the governor doesn't renew it. Now, that could happen. The governor could either stop the peacetime emergency declaration completely. Now, that's not just about evictions, right? That's about, can we close restaurants and salons and cinemas and bowling alleys and churches and synagogues? That's a different question, but the eviction moratorium is tied to that decision. So the governor could stop with the peacetime emergency declarations. The governor could also say, you know what, I'm going to end the eviction moratorium. That's a separate order. And so the governor unilaterally put that in place. The governor could end it just as unilaterally. This could also be ended, either the peacetime emergency declaration or the eviction moratorium. I suppose it's theoretically possible for the House and Senate to end those. But at the very least, for the peacetime emergency, which is the most likely way this gets ended, both the Senate and the House would have to vote a simple majority to end the peacetime emergency declaration. Every time that's been tried, the Senate in Minnesota has, which is controlled by Republicans, has voted to end the peacetime emergency. The House, controlled by Democrats, they have the majority there, has voted not to end the peacetime emergency. Of course, Governor Walz is a Democrat, and so it's presumed that as long as the governor thinks that it's still warranted, the House will go along with what the governor is saying, but you never know. The vote has actually moved around over time when there have been votes And so it's not always the same exact number. And it's hard to say. Right now, while we're in session, when the governor makes these declarations, there's no requirement for the Senate or the House to even vote on it. They have no obligation to do so, although they could. When the session ends, which is actually a little over a month from now, if the governor renews an executive order declaring that peacetime emergency once again, so let's say it's in June, for instance, then the legislature is automatically called back into special session. Normally, special sessions only happen when the governor states they want to have a special session. We've seen these in prior years, certainly a lot in the last 20 years or so, where there's budget fights that go down to the wire. But anyhow, so the legislature could end this, the governor could end it, a court challenge could end it. I don't see court challenges being likely to end this. There've been a couple that have been tried. There've been many around the country, most fail, and nothing's been successful in Minnesota yet. So there is political pressure, certainly, on the governor to end the eviction moratorium from a lot of different angles. But so far, the governor has done a cost-benefit analysis and decided to keep it in place. When is it going to end? We don't know. There are legislative theories being put forward right now that are more than theories at this point. In fact, go to the next slide if you could, Eric. That the Senate and the House both have versions of what's being described as an eviction off-ramp, an eviction moratorium off-ramp. And the Senate version, again, the Republicans control the Senate, is quite a bit more favorable in most ways to landlords. The House version, more favorable to renters. That's the Democrat controlled chamber. Both versions have an additional exception to the eviction moratorium. Right now, the exceptions we have are pretty minimal. Here they are. A landlord can evict currently if a tenant seriously endangers others on the property, if the tenant has caused significant property damage, or if the landlord wants to move in, or their immediate family member needs to move in, I should say, not wants to move in. And the last exception is tied to a anti-drug law in landlord-tenant law that's been around since the early 90s. Actually, it says you can't have drugs, illegal guns, like a sawed-off shotgun, an automatic weapon, been convicted of a felony, stolen property or prostitution, or to some degree, there's domestic abuse perpetrated by the tenant. That's it. Those are the exceptions. Both the Senate and the House versions that are, like I said, in various stages of where they are in the legislative process, add what's known as a material breach to the exceptions list. Now, this would be a big step in a direction back towards normalcy. Just so we're clear, most evictions in Minnesota pre-pandemic, and by most I mean the giant majority, over 90%, are filed for or were filed for non-payment of rent. The other reasons why landlords file evictions, well, the tenant, their lease ended and the landlord decided not to renew the lease, so they'd file an eviction for holding over. There's some of those, but another category, and a bigger category than the holding over, usually, is for what we call a breach of the lease. So there's all kinds of rules in most leases, and if the tenant violates one of those rules, or they have a pet when they're not supposed to, their boyfriend or girlfriend moved in and they're not on the lease, those would be the two leading ones where landlords file evictions for breach. Right now, a landlord can't file for an unauthorized occupant. A family member has moved in. A landlord can't file for a pet if you're not supposed to have a dog. They can't file for non-payment of rent, and that's the big one. That's the one that really matters. That's most evictions. But if material breach gets added to the reasons that are exceptions to the eviction moratorium, then yeah, there's going to be more evictions. It's not going to be the wide open floodgates of saying, hey, for non-payment, a landlord can file an eviction, but it will certainly add evictions to the calendars in housing courts and district courts around the state. As mentioned, the bills are at different legislative stops. It's complicated, and I don't even pretend to understand all of it myself, even though I know a little bit about it. But most bills have to go through certain numbers of committees and then get approved by the entire chamber. But then that means the other chamber still has a role in deciding whether they like it or not. And then finally, the governor has veto power over things as well. So a bill isn't a law until it's a law. It's theoretical. It might be more certain in some cases than others, but until it's actually signed by the governor or it's veto proof with enough votes, it's going to be Still speculative. Both bills also have sort of different timelines when things would occur. I think the largest difference between the Senate and the House bill, the one that matters most to me as a tenant advocate, is that there's no notice requirement in the Senate bill, that the landlord would have to notify the tenant that suddenly they're able to file an eviction again. There would just become a day, maybe to be 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it is, where after that amount of time, the landlord could file an eviction, but there's no requirement that the landlord notify the tenant that the eviction's coming, which in my mind is maybe the most important thing that should happen once the eviction moratorium is lifted. Whatever day the evictions are going to be fileable, a landlord personally, with their relationship with the tenant, informing the tenant, hey, things have changed. I know you haven't paid rent for 5 months because of the moratorium, but on this day, we're able to file an eviction. That kind of notice requirement seems critical to me. It was required in the CARES Act, which was the first nationwide act that was issued back in March of last year. There was a 30-day notice requirement there, and that was a bipartisan agreed upon rule in the CARES Act. So there's precedent out there. But to me, that's the one that's really essential, and it may also help tenants in qualifying for various types of financial assistance that might be available. Go ahead and go to the next slide if you would too. Thanks. Okay, I mentioned the CDC order. So when last we met was March 24th, we didn't know, there were rumors that President Biden was going to extend the CDC moratorium on evictions. The rumor at that point, I think, was still that it was going to go through September. Instead, what we got was an extension through June of this year. There were minor tweaks to the CDC order, but I don't think they're substantial. Full disclosure, we don't really use the CDC order in Minnesota because it explicitly defers to more protective tenant rules. If a state has more tenant protection built in, then the CDC sort of says, go ahead, use your state rules instead. So the Minnesota rules still remain the primary hurdle for any landlord wanting to file an eviction in Minnesota, certainly for non-payment of rent. The CDC order, we talked about this the last couple of times that we've met, has been challenged several times around the country. To date, still the most notable court decisions. There have been several that have been in favor of the moratorium. Looking at them as early as, maybe October of last year or November of last year, there was one in Georgia that was issued, a district court decision, federal district court, that I remember reading the complaint put forth by the landlords, and it just seemed like it had no shot, and it didn't have any shot. In my mind, the landlord groups were all going about this the wrong way, which was to say that it was unconstitutional, that the whole concept of any government agency declaring evictions off limits shouldn't be allowed under the Constitution. You can find a lot of stuff in the Constitution. There's a lot there, and we've got hundreds of years of court decisions interpreting it, and that seemed like a stretch to me. However, the latest and much more successful attack on the CDC moratorium has been arguing that the CDC's statute that they were relying on, authorizing them to declare this eviction moratorium throughout the United States, everywhere in the country, it's not legal to file a non-payment of rent eviction under the CDC order that we're still under, which was initially instituted by President Trump back in September of last year. But the latest attack has been, in my mind, a much stronger attack from landlord groups, which is that the CDC's authorizing statute didn't authorize this. It didn't authorize the eviction moratorium. I remember when President Trump, actually there was like a waiting period. President Trump's order said, you know what, in a couple of weeks, we're going to enact this order. This is going to get in place based on this federal statute that authorizes the CDC to stop bad stuff from going state to state, basically. And I remember reading that statute back then and just wondering, how is it that the CDC has the authority to institute an eviction moratorium here based on these words in that statute, which really were about limiting the transport of crops and animals from state to state. I mean, it's not hard to imagine. Let's say that all the pigs in the United States suddenly are carrying a disease, and the CDC says, we got to clamp down. No more pigs can be crossed across state lines. that made a lot of sense and certainly within their purview. But most importantly, it was in the statute. That's what it said they could do. This kind of broad, we can stop evictions from being filed, it really took some imagination to try to see that being stretched to where we are now. And so that's been the attack. The decisions that we've seen recently, there's one out of Texas where there's a district court judge that said more or less that broad constitutional argument that I said didn't really make much sense to me. That actually was good enough for a Texas judge. That's the only judge so far that's said that's sufficient. But the ones in Tennessee and Ohio are the ones that I think are the most concerning from how long are the eviction moratoriums going to be kept in place, tenant advocate perspective, because they really looked at that statute. What did that statute authorize the CDC to do? I think it would be a very different question if Congress authorized this. There was a brief time where that happened here. President Trump's original CDC order ended December 31 of last calendar year. President-elect at the time, Biden, wasn't in power. President Trump was on his way out of power. And then Congress had to decide, well, what do we do for these 20 days until the president changes hands? And so they extended it for 30 days under a congressional order. That was the one time we had a congressional stamp of approval, which might be the single best argument that one might make against these Tennessee and Ohio cases is, wait a second, Congress said it was okay at one point. And so maybe that's got more weight to it somehow. That's not the one we're using right now. Right now, it's just the CDC executive order, and we're in the second version of that under President Biden's tenure. But to sum it up, the CDC order is still relevant. It's still the law in place. It's still what landlords are supposed to comply with throughout the United States. But it's nowhere near as strong as it was a month ago even. Its footing is much weaker than it was. Go ahead and go on to our map page there, Eric. Yeah, thanks. So this is a map showing the circuits in the United States. So as you can see, I count 11 at the top of my head right now. I don't really practice in federal court. I do state law stuff. That's what landlord tenant law almost always is exclusively. As you can see, we are in the 8th circuit here. It's a wide circuit, so there's a lot of geographic area that it covers, not as big as the 9th or even the 10th, but still it's a lot of area to cover. And our adverse cases for the order is in Texas, the 5th circuit. We have 2 from the 6th circuit. So if I was wondering, am I in Ohio or in Tennessee, what are the rules? Does the CDC order apply to me? I think it's a tougher argument to make currently. Again, these are just district court judges though. They're not appellate court hearings. Once we get an appellate court decision, if we get one, that's going to make it a lot more difficult. And then if we get competing appellate court decisions, that's when the Supreme Court is most likely to take one of these types of cases. If we have, let's say the 8th District Court of Appeals rules that the CDC order is legal and constitutional, and the 6th does not. Those are the kinds of times when the Supreme Court is most likely to step in and take a case, although it's never a guarantee. The US Supreme Court gets to take whatever cases they want. I think there's only one almost certain exception, and that is if the boundary lines of a state have moved, which sounds impossible, but it happens. Rivers shift over time. And so those are, I think, the only cases where it's almost a certainty that there will be a Supreme Court hearing on that. Okay, I think that was about the 20 minutes that we had talked about. I'll grab a drink of something and Eric will cover some logistic stuff, and then we'll get to some questions.
Yeah, well, another thing that we did say in the materials for today's session is that we might talk about any updates to rental assistance programs. And so I just want to circle back and mention that in our last webinar, we had, and that was on March 24th, we had guest speaker, Minnesota Housing Deputy Commissioner Rachel Robinson, who did discuss at that time on the 24th of March, so 3 weeks ago, their planned rollout of the COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program funds that were released in December, or that were approved by Congress and President Trump in December of last year, and it's taken some time for those dollars to get out the door and for guidance to come from Department of Treasury. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to both the recording of that session. So if you want to review it and see what Rachel had to say about the program and some of the details involved in it. And there was plenty of questions that came in for her about the program. The program, unfortunately, has not yet launched, as I'm sure some folks know on this call. My understanding is they're trying to get things lined up as best as possible so that there's not delays. And so I will also put in the chat the information about where you can find the most up-to-date information about the program. It is renthelpmn.org. And if you actually go to that website right now, they have checklists that you can download if you're a tenant or if you're a landlord to get ready for the program. So it'll explain to you what you need to be prepared to apply, or as a landlord, what you need to do to respond or to requests for the program, rent coming in for the program. So and then my understanding is that when it does launch, there'll be information on that website. You'll be able to apply online. Also be able to apply via dialing 211 once it does get up and running. So I'll put that information in the chat. We're sorry we can't share more about it at this time, but again, that's the most up-to-date information you can get on it on that website and with the webinar. And I know Minnesota Housing, and maybe I'll try to find this too. Minnesota Housing has had a number. That's the State Department for Housing that's overseeing the statewide program. They did have some public webinars about it as well, and they're working in conjunction with a number of other local city and county governments on the program rollout. So,
do we have a prediction on when they think it might be live at this point, or have they stopped making predictions?
I think I read something on Twitter today that Minnesota Housing Commissioner Ho was saying they're taking it day by day. So it should be sometime very, very soon.
Okay, great.
Okay, so yeah, we probably won't be able to answer many questions about that because there's not really more details. So the resources I put in the chat should help. If I find the links to the Minnesota Housing webinar recordings, I'll put it in the chat too. But with that, we will kick off some of the questions that were submitted by people who registered for today's webinar in advance. And I'll just start them off here. Valerie is asking, is non-payment the only qualifier under the eviction moratorium? What is not covered?
Yeah, I saw that question and I wasn't exactly sure what Valerie was referring to, but I'll try to answer it in a couple different ways. First of all, the state moratorium bans evictions for everything except the exceptions that I talked about. And I actually understated what it does. It also stops non-renewals of leases or terminations of leases. An eviction is simply the court case, which is not how most tenancies end in Minnesota. Most of the time when a tenancy ends, either the tenant gives notice to the landlord or the landlord gives notice to the tenant. There's no court involvement at all. But currently a tenant is allowed to give notice. I don't want to live here past the end of my lease, but a landlord is not allowed to give a notice. They're not allowed to non-renew a lease. Even if it's month to month, they can't just say, here's your month's notice. The theory being that, we don't want people moving around unnecessarily during the pandemic. And so if that's the question, it's not just non-payment of rent. Like I mentioned, it's any breach of the lease, a landlord cannot file an eviction for. The only exceptions, once again, significant property damage, seriously endangering others, drugs, guns, prostitution on the property, or the landlord or their family member needs to move into the unit itself. That's all we have for the exceptions. Now, the federal moratorium, the CDC moratorium, so it's confusing. If you just Google up eviction moratoriums, that might be the first thing you find is the CDC federal moratorium. Once again, that doesn't play much of a role in Minnesota currently. It's sort of a backstop, really, but it doesn't have a very active role for the giant majority of cases in Minnesota. So that does have qualifications where the tenant's income can only be a certain level, and the tenant has to produce it's not a notarized statement, but a declaration saying that they've tried to get all the available assistance that's available out there and been unable to do it as well. And so there are some additional qualifications in the CDC federal moratorium, but again, that doesn't play a role in Minnesota. A tenant doesn't need to declare their income or that they've tried to get the money. There's no requirement of any of those things currently in Minnesota.
All right, Lynette, who is a tenant, asks or states, my landlord owns the single townhome I have lived in for 11 years, and he forced a new lease with $150 a month increase. And then the question seems to have been cut off, but it says probably last month. So
Right.
we're not sure of the question, but
well, we got the rent increase part. And so
Yeah.
that's a part of the question, probably the key part of the question. And so one of the questions we've been getting throughout the pandemic, certainly a lot of these questions are, can the landlord raise my rent? Right? Is the landlord allowed to raise my rent? So there's a couple ways to answer that. First of all, again, a landlord is not allowed to not renew a lease. They're not allowed to do that. They just aren't. And so is a rent increase effectively the same as a non-renewal is a fair, somewhat theoretical question. My view since the beginning of the pandemic, and it hasn't really changed, is that, yeah, I think a raising of the rent is a fundamental non-renewal of the lease. I think it is. And I'll tell you why. Leases look a lot of different ways. I look at leases virtually every day that I work on our tenant hotline. We get emails sent to again, it's a free service. We advise renters throughout the state, either through an email or through our over the hotline service. And I look at leases a lot. Some leases are literally written on half of a cocktail napkin, but most aren't. Most are 1 or 2 pages to 50 pages long, which is sort of the latest trend we're seeing in leasing, is that leases are growing and growing and growing. I've been doing this since 1996. They didn't used to look like this. There's 50 page, and I'm not exaggerating, there are 50-page leases out there that we see more and more of. Anyhow, even though there's 50 pages to a lease, there really are 4, I call them pillars, or table legs, if you want to use that, that hold up a lease. There are 4 key components to any lease. We've got the rent, which is the amount, right? We've got the location. What's the actual address, including the apartment number if there's one. The parties, who's the landlord, who's the tenant, and what's the duration? How long is the contract for? Is it month to month? Is it 1 year? Those are the 4 key elements that you almost can't really have a lease without. They don't really work. Sometimes you won't see any duration listed, but it becomes a month to month because that's when the tenant owes the rent. And so the law sort of figures that part out. But everything else, how much is the rent? The law doesn't figure that out for you. Who are the parties? The law doesn't tell you that. What's the actual address? The law doesn't tell you that. The only one the law can sort of answer the question for is on the duration. So you really have those 3 things that have to be in that contract. And saying that the rent is going to be $150 more, first of all, we don't know how much the rent was originally. So it's hard to know what percentage the increase is. During the pandemic, and this is still in place, essential items, essential services are still capped by a price gouging executive order from the governor. I think we can all remember and are thankful that we lived through the great toilet paper scare of last year, where I think there was real concern that grocery stores were going to start charging $100 for a 4-pack of toilet paper, and milk and cheese and bread and everything. And the governor instituted the anti-price gouging order. So if the landlord tried to raise the rent over 20% in Lynette's case, then that would be a violation of the price gouging rule. Now, my theory about the pillars, that a landlord non-renewing a lease by raising the rent, we've had conversations with the Attorney General's office, which is the primary entity in charge of enforcing the governor's orders. And I think theoretically, they've always sort of said, yeah, that's probably right, but we just don't have the staffing to go after every landlord that does that. We got to go after the landlords that really violate the anti-eviction statute, that are locking people out, which we've seen a dramatic increase in the last year versus prior years, or actually filing evictions when they shouldn't, or threatening to file evictions. So those are the cases we have to spend our limited staff time on. But I believe that a rent increase shouldn't be legal. It's not really being enforced against it, though. So rent increases are happening. That's just the reality of what's on the ground. The $150 a month, if that's over the 20%, then yeah, that would be a price gouging violation. And it's a huge penalty under the price gouging violation. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I can't remember. The eviction one is, I think, $1,000, but this one is much higher, $5,000 or $20,000, some really high number for a landlord violating that rule.
$10,000 it looks like. I put
10,000, thanks, you've got it pulled up. I try not to look around and scroll on stuff while I'm doing these speeches. He looks all over the internet. I never know what he's working on. Facebook. Well, you're not on Facebook, are you, Eric?
I'm not on Facebook.
Not on Facebook.
I'm not.
All right. What's our next question?
Okay. Brad, a landlord, asked, when can we take people to claims court to get back rent? Claims court or conciliation court?
Yeah. Conciliation court is the official name for it. Small claims court. I was having dinner with my kids a couple weeks ago, and I'm a lawyer, so one of my kids, he's 14, was arguing with my 20-year-old kid about something, and I think the 20-year-old said he was going to sue my other kid. I'm going to sue you, which is what lawyers' kids, I think, threaten a lot to do. And my youngest said, small claims court, and then the counter was, no, we're going to big claims court, which is a much better name. In fact, I think there should be levels: large claims court, extra large, 2XL. But no, we just have small claims, and district court is what it's officially called. It's not called big claims court. Anyhow, can you sue in small claims court now? Yeah, you can actually sue in small claims court now. When are you going to have your hearing is a much different question. Just to be clear, small claims court is where landlords go. The most common claim you'll see in small claims court from a landlord against a tenant is trying to recover rent. If a landlord files an eviction during normal times, it's for non-payment of rent. The tenant can pay and stay. It's called redemption. They pay the rent, the court costs. Maybe the landlord hired the sheriff or process server to serve them some papers, some late fees as well. If the tenant pays all those things, they get to stay. It's called redeeming or redemption. And that's one of the most common defenses that tenants use in non-payment of rent cases. But if the tenant doesn't pay and the tenant gets evicted, the landlord doesn't win money. They win possession. That's all a landlord really wins in an eviction. It's a summary proceeding. It's designed to happen really fast, but it's got a limited purpose, and that's to determine who has the right to possess the place. So small claims court is where landlords end up going if the claim is under $15,000. You can sue for up to $15,000 in Minnesota, which is among the higher numbers in the United States. And then you get a judgment against the tenant. You've got to take a few steps after that, but you can have a judgment that actually really has a huge impact on somebody's credit going forward. In fact, it can effectively block credit for something like a mortgage or even a car loan. Some landlords do that. They go to small claims court. It costs about $70 to file. It's set at a fairly low price. And in general, a landlord or a tenant wouldn't need a lawyer to file a claim in conciliation court. If you're incorporated, you might need an attorney depending on which county you're in throughout the state. But yeah, a landlord can file a claim in small claims court right now. It varies a lot from county to county, or more accurately, district to district, how quickly you'll have a hearing. It used to be, I would say, 3 to 8 weeks pre-pandemic to have a conciliation court case. Now it might be months, maybe it'll be a year before you'll have a hearing, but it can be filed currently. There is one reason, by the way, to hold off on filing as a landlord. Well, there's more than one. Number one, the money that we're talking about, that Eric was talking about, that's coming through the state that was issued by the federal government. This is not theoretical money, it's real money. They're just figuring out how to pass it out. And there's another round of money that they aren't even looking at yet, I don't think, that was already authorized by the federal government. Not theoretical money, real money. Most of these programs historically have required that if there's going to be money coming from the government, it's going to be to stabilize somebody's housing. Okay. So let's say the tenant were to leave because a landlord has intimidated them to go. Well, landlord's probably, I don't know exactly how these programs are going to play out, but probably not going to be entitled to that money back. So there is a vested interest for most landlords to keep the tenant there. The other thing I'll mention is if you're going to sue in small claims court, you'd rather sue for everything at once instead of having to sue for future months due. Because it's difficult to legally demand future rent What if the place were to burn to the ground? Rent wouldn't be due anymore at that point. And I'm certainly not trying to tell people to go start a fire to stop rent from being due. That's a silly concept, although I'm sure somebody's tried it somewhere in the US already this pandemic. But most landlords would wait in pre-pandemic times. If they had somebody that had stopped paying, they'd wait until the final bill is known before they'd sue in small claims court after the eviction process is done, not in the middle of it. Because you might as well sue just once, pay your $70 just once, and only have to go to court once for the total amount. And like I said, you can go for up to $15,000, so that's quite a few months for most folks. Sorry, longer answer than Brad was probably looking for there.
No, it's, I mean, I think it's particularly useful to just, again, point out that there is I mean, an unprecedented, we talked about it with Deputy Commissioner Robinson 3 weeks ago. It's an unprecedented amount of rental assistance. Our state has never seen anything like this. So it's on its way. So with that, there's two related questions I'm going to stick together here. One from Tracy. I think they're both from Landlords. Tracy says, tenant owes 4 months of rent and is avoiding me. Letters, phone messages, phone calls, text messages have gone unanswered. Not really a question there, but then Scott has a similar question, also a landlord. I have a tenant whose lease ends in a month and a half. I have not had any response to any of my emails, phone calls, messages, letters, certified letters in over 5 months. I've gone to the property. It's not being kept up by the tenant per the lease, and no one's answered the door. I've left notes a few times for the tenant to contact me, and I've heard nothing. How am I supposed to verify that the tenant intends to be off the property at the end of the lease? So maybe two slightly different questions, but yeah, I guess lack of communication from a tenant is the situation.
Right. So Tracy's question, which is, hey, a tenant owes 4 months of rent and they're avoiding me. How do I get them to reply? Honestly, I think what Eric was talking about before I started diving into the question and answer session was once this money system is known, the Minnesota housing monetary system is set up and it's actually live, telling the tenant, hey, look, you might qualify for this. I'll help you fill it out. I'll help you sign the forms that we need to sign together, would make a lot of sense, because it's better for both of you. It's better for the landlord. It's better for the tenant that you qualify for that money. If they do qualify for the money, there's a really strong incentive, and the tenant might not know about it. There's so much stuff out there, and a lot of people have mentally and physically turtled up, and they just kind of hope it all goes away. And that is the mentality. Having talked to tenants my entire career, sometimes they'll take that approach on, that this is just too much and I'm just going to not answer any phone calls or texts or the door, and just kind of hope that things disappear. It never works that way. But if you're saying, give me my money, that's a very different text than, hey, I know that you owe money, but this program is apparently available and we might be able to get your rent covered through the government if we work on this together. That's a very different text. And so it might be the kind of thing that reaches the tenant more effectively than what's been working so far. So it might make sense to wait until this is actually a live program. But once it is live, why not contact the tenant with that and say, hey, let's try to qualify for this together to get your debt paid so you're back current on your lease. And I know tenants that are out there that could start paying their rent. They have the income coming in right now, but they can't get caught up on the back stuff, which is truly what these programs are hoping to solve. That's really what they want to be able to swoop in and say, you know what, here's $3,000, problem solved. You're not going to get evicted. Now we're going to go on to the next person. That's what they're really hoping to do with these programs. And so that might be the exact situation you're in. Scott's question is a little bit different, which is, how do I figure out if the property's abandoned? I think is kind of the key part to his question. And so what I always recommend for a landlord to do in these situations is to contact the tenant in every possible way that you have. Texts, letter, an actual piece of paper mail, not just certified mail. Certified mail requires a signature, so if nobody signs for it, nothing happens to it. I'd send one regular mail as well, emails, whatever you have. And you try to let the tenant know, hey, look, it looks like you've moved out and I'm going to be coming in on this day. I'm going to be masked up. I'd video yourself entering, so have at least 2 people involved. And you knock on the door, you announce, you go in, and then before you go in any other doors, you knock on the door and say, hey, here's who I am. I'm coming in. and you video the entire thing. Now, sometimes the tenant has completely abandoned the place. They just have. Ideally, what you'd get in those situations is once you figure that out, you'd get some sort of confirmation from the tenant that they have left, so that you can re-rent to somebody else to minimize the tenant's liability going forward. It's in the tenant's best interest. They might not realize that, but it's in their best interest to let you know. Normal times, the safest, most conservative answer that a landlord attorney would probably tell you, I'm a tenant attorney, but I've heard landlord attorneys talk, and this is what they tell you, is the safest thing would be to file an eviction. But right now, you really can't file an eviction for not paying rent. So ideally, you'd get the tenant to say, yeah, I've given up possession. Here's the keys, in fact, in a text or something like that would be ideal for you to show this.
All right. We occasionally get these. Somebody signs up for the webinar and just puts a topic in the question field. So we got Tanisha just put eviction, and so I want to leave this one in here just to remind folks, and that's why we leave it up on the screen, that if you're a tenant and you have a question about your specific situation, you can call our tenant hotline and get advice. We do these seminars just to help keep folks updated on what's going on with the changing laws during the pandemic, and try to just give general information. So if you do have a specific question about an eviction or any other legal issue you're facing as a residential tenant in Minnesota, call our hotline or email us, and the info's on the page right there.
Yep, it's free.
Holly is asking, can a landlord file for eviction for a safety hazard?
So yeah, I mean, here are what the words that are used in the executive order exception list are: if the tenant seriously endangers others on the premises. So that would be neighbors, the landlord themselves, a delivery person, somebody delivering mail. So endangering others on the premises, or has caused significant property damage, which is kind of past tense, right? So a safety hazard implies, I think, not past tense, that it hasn't occurred already, that it's maybe endangering others. The question is it seriously endangering others? I know that's a strange modifying word. Honestly, that's the reason why we have judges, I guess, is to decide what's seriously endangering somebody and what's not. But maybe is the short answer. It would be very fact specific.
All right. Let's see here. Okay, Amanda has a question. Amanda is with, you know what, this might be related to a question that came in the chat.
Yeah, let's use the one from the chat, because everybody, the Q&A, because everybody can see that one. Right?
Yeah, I think that's the same question. So in the Q&A, a group of roommates in St. Paul has a lease through May 31st. One roommate has begun acting erratically, leaving the door open, entering bedrooms during the night, damaging the unit, leaving opioids on the floor. Roommates wish to stay but would like this person removed. Can this person be asked to leave? Which roommate has claim on the apartment?
Okay, there's a lot there, and if this is Amanda, feel free to contact our tenant hotline, whatever your name is. You might want to get specific advice, whether it's an email or a call to our tenant hotline. But I'll take a few pieces of this question and try to answer what I can here. The starting question I'm going to answer is the last one. Which roommate has claim on the apartment? This is a question we get a lot. We have 2 or 3 roommates in a place. Hey, my name is first on the lease, so I'm the primary leaseholder. People will say stuff like that. It's not really how it's designed in Minnesota. If there's 2 roommates, chances are they are sort of co-equal legally on the lease. Now that can be good and bad for both of the tenants. Sometimes that means that if one tenant can't pay, the other one has to pay the full rent, not just their own half, if there's 2 roommates. And so who has a claim on the apartment? If there weren't any of these other factors, no tenant has a superior claim over the other tenants in most cases in Minnesota. That's just not how it's designed. But we've got a specific set of facts here, and the question has some key stuff. We have the roommate acting erratically, leaving the door open, entering bedrooms, I assume that means other people's bedrooms during the night, damaging the unit, leaving opioids on the floor. All right. So those are our 4 facts that we have additionally here. And at some point, maybe we've got a situation where the roommates might be able to get some sort of order for protection / restraining order-ish type thing against this roommate, which might effectively stop them from being able to be in the rental unit. That might be the simplest way to get the tenant removed. Right now, because of the pandemic, the landlord, they can try an eviction. Landlords don't like filing evictions against one roommate out of 4. That's just not what they normally do. If there are drugs in the property, for instance, and the landlord knows about it, then the landlord could file an eviction probably against all 4 roommates, is how it's typically set up. And it's rare that a landlord will say, yeah, I'll evict just the one. The way to get the one person out is probably through, like I said, the restraining order for protection approach, which isn't something we spend a lot of time in that world. Folks that do domestic abuse, battered spouse, battered victims, that kind of work, spend a lot more time in that world, but it's something that's possible. There is the first instinct that I have. Again, worth calling our tenant hotline for free or sending an email to try to figure out what specific options you have with some more detail, because we're going to want to get a lot more facts, and it's the kind of thing you probably don't want to share over an open forum like this.
Right. Kaylee is saying being terminated from a HUD program during the emergency pandemic.
So Kaylee, my first bit of advice here is whatever city you're in, you'd probably want to contact legal aid as quickly as possible. Various defenses become much weaker the longer you wait to contact legal aid. And I say legal aid here because our office is a brief over the phone / email service. That's what we do. We talk to roughly 15,000 people every year. No way we could do that if we did what's called full representation, where a lawyer can step in and say, you know what, I'm going to take your case. If this goes to court, I'm going to represent you. I'm going to negotiate with your landlord. Our advice is much briefer than that. And legal aid is absolutely the experts on this type of subsidized program that you're referencing here. And so they'll know the nuances, the legal requirements of it. And that's who I'd recommend that you contact in this situation. If you don't know who to call, you can contact our hotline. We'll make sure in your city you get the right place.
All right. I'm going to try to get through this one. And
Yeah, there's a lot here and it's a little jumbled.
this one, yeah. So Sandra, if you're on and we jumble this, let us know. It sounds like it's a landlord. Have apartment that where the tenant's not living there. Tenants only paid $200 rent since December of 2020. Told us consider our apartment March 11th, 2020 via text. I'm guessing consider our apartment to be vacant at that point. Sandra, the landlord, waited 2 weeks to give the tenant time to move, then notified the tenant via text that the landlord would be changing the locks and taking the apartment back. Tenant then said she did not put in writing that she was moving. Text, okay, the text was consider our apartment vacant on March 11th, and that the tenant will sue them if they enter. Is there anything we can do to get apartment back? And then separately, this person had another question, just how can you get a tenant to apply for rental assistance funds?
Right. Okay. So I'll take the first part first here. It sounds like the tenant maybe gave a notice to vacate via text and then backed out at some point, maybe right at the last second. And the landlord is frustrated, wants her to go right now. Could the landlord file an eviction for this at this point? I don't think so, is the short answer under the state moratorium on evictions. That would be for holding over. And I don't think there's a good argument that you can fit it into any of the exceptions that are there in the governor's executive order. That'll change eventually when the moratorium gets lifted. But right now, filing an eviction or threatening to file an eviction against the tenant for that reason probably doesn't hold up. You might very well get a call from the Attorney General's office saying you can't do it. As far as how do you get the tenant to apply for the funds, once again, my advice to a landlord today is wait day by day until Minnesota Housing's money is officially available. And then send the link to the tenant and say, hey, look, we want you to get current on rent, and no deception here. Selfishly, we want you to get current on rent so we get paid. But it's going to help you later on because you're not going to have this outstanding debt hanging over you. yeah, that we can chase you for later, which we don't want to have to do. We'd much rather try to qualify for this money, which was earmarked for exactly this reason. This is what this fund was created for. Again, there are going to be millions, if not tens of millions of people that have never tried to qualify for any kind of, in their mind, subsidy before, that are going to be eligible for the subsidy. And they won't intuitively understand that it might apply to them. They just won't. I've talked to folks like this for my entire career that have faced an eviction because they lost a job, or their spouse died, or the spouse left them, and suddenly they don't have any funding for rent, and they've never heard of emergency assistance before. And I'll explain that, oh, ultimately this is federal money that might be able to pay your rent for a month or two to get you back on your feet. And they'll just be in disbelief, utter disbelief, that a program like that exists. Well, what's the catch? There's no way that somebody's just going to pay my rent. And sometimes it worked, that it would pay their rent. Now, this is much bigger. This is just, as Eric has said, this is an unprecedented amount of money. And this is just wave number 2 of the money. And there's another wave guaranteed to come. And there's another one proposed now, I think. So there's a lot of money out there, and it's going to solve a lot of these problems. Now, it might not fix the relationship that Sandra has with her tenant going forward, but it's going to go a long ways towards doing that. If the money gets paid, then maybe the tenant can start paying the rent again going forward. And I know that some of these programs have talked about future rent payments as well to get the tenant back on their feet. I know that the one in Minnesota that's being proposed seriously right now is not going to do that immediately, but they're still hoping to do that later on.
Yeah, and the state program, again, renthelpmn.org, we put the link in the chat. Deputy Commissioner Robinson did say when she was on our webinar 3 weeks ago that landlords can initiate once it opens, landlords can initiate applications in the system. Renters have to provide income information inside and sign the application. Okay, so I just noticed in the Q&A, the tenant that had asked the question of in St. Cloud about the roommate is saying that roommate's the newest to live there, but it's a new lease with all 4 on it. Not sure if that changes anything.
No. The fact that they're the newest roommate probably, and I understand the question that somebody might have a seniority thought process there, that they're more seniors in the tenancy, so they'd have more rights, but generally they don't. Yeah.
Okay. We have just a couple more of pre-submitted questions, and then we'll jump to the 6 or so we have.
Yeah, I think we can get through these.
15 minutes left. So Eric, a tenant, is saying landlord, and this one is a little different. Landlord's first eviction denied due to not providing a 7-day notice. The second eviction apparently was approved. The tenant didn't receive notice. Missed it, 24 hours given. It's a little bit cryptic. I'm not sure if we can.
Yep. Okay. So the 7-day notice, what we're talking about there is a new feature in the pandemic eviction moratorium exceptions, that if a landlord wants to file an eviction for any reason, they have to warn the tenant with a 7-day warning first. And so apparently in the first eviction that this landlord filed, that wasn't done, or it wasn't done properly. And the second time the landlord filed, apparently it was, the tenant didn't get notice of it. And I think at this point, what Eric is asking is that, hey, there's been a 24-hour notice, implies that there's a writ on the door. That's probably what that means. This is a little bit cryptic. Short answer here, I'm talking to Eric, the person who sent the question, and not the guy on the screen, my boss. The short answer here is you need to call us or legal aid right now. 24-hour notice is not, that's real. That's close to final. After the 24 hours, the landlord can call the sheriff back and schedule a move out and remove you. So I don't know when this question was submitted. I'm actually concerned about that because, if it was submitted 2 or 3 days ago, then we need to hear from you right now. Call our hotline, call legal aid in your area, but you need to get some specific advice on what options you have, if any, at this point. I'm not going to sugarcoat this and say that it's easy to try to contest this, but if there is any chance, you need to talk to somebody that works in this field right away directly.
All right, and then I just noticed again in the Q&A that Lynette, whose question we took earlier that was cut off, is here. my landlord that was about the rent increase. My landlord forced a 12% increase in lease last April. Do I have any recourse? That lease ends May 31, 2021. Do I have to give a 30-day notice?
Lynette, again, for you, I'd say it makes a lot of sense for you to contact our hotline. Again, it's free, or you can submit a question email. But I will say that the question disappeared. The short answer here is that you might have to give a 30-day notice. It depends on what your lease says. Would you have any recourse about that rent increase that you got? If you've been paying it for a year, I'm not sure. I mean, you could try suing in small claims court saying, hey, I overpaid. The landlord didn't have the power to do this. Probably not the ideal way to contest it, but the ideal way to contest it would be really risky. And that would be you'd kind of invite the landlord to file an eviction by not paying what they're demanding. So you could try it, but I can't guarantee a success on that. And I think the footing is a little bit worse in small claims court later, trying to recover what you've already paid than refusing to pay it in an eviction defense type setting.
All right. So again, our contact information for the free and confidential hotline is up on your screen. Okay, Greg, a landlord, asks that says his wife, who's a realtor, and him would like to sell one of their rental houses. The renter in this place has been on a month-to-month lease tenancy for the last 16 months. The original 1 year lease had ended. Rent is being paid and is current. Can him and his wife legally sell the house during the peacetime emergency?
Good question, Greg. Something we haven't covered today. Yes, you can sell the house. There's no law prohibiting the sale of the house. Now, if the new owner wants to take possession, for instance, I don't think that can happen until they've purchased the house. So the actual sale has occurred, not just a purchase agreement, but the actual sale has occurred. And then they'd have to give the notice under the governor's executive order. Plus, they probably have to give a full rental period's notice at least, depending on how your lease was worded. So yeah, there's no law that says that you can't do this. Is the short answer. Yes, you can sell a home during the pandemic. It's a good question, though. It wasn't always clear at the beginning of the pandemic if that was legal, but it is certainly clear now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I remember a year ago when we were doing one of our first sessions, we were asking, is it legal for people to move during the
right?
emergency?
The first order, it was really hard to tell, and we got information from the governor's office that yeah, of course they can move. Well, you need to say that because it really doesn't. So yeah, it got fixed.
Okay, we've got 5 pending questions, and
Yeah.
we've got a little over 10 minutes, so we'll capture these. Anonymous asks if material breach gets added. I'm guessing, so this is probably in relation to the off-ramp proposals of the eviction suspension. If material breach gets added, could landlords also do non-renewals for breach of lease?
Yeah, I mean, both off-ramps, or certainly the Senate version has a lot about non-renewals being possible as well. Probably is my best guess. Maybe is my certain answer. I'm certain that it's a maybe here. But yeah, I think that's possible that would be added, non-renewals. But material breach is seen as a different thing because that can be done in the middle of a lease. In the middle of a 5-year lease, you can file an eviction for non-compliance with the contract itself. But yeah, I think non-renewals very possible to get added to an eviction off-ramp as well. And again, all of this is going to end eventually. Eventually, all the moratoriums are over. And so we'll be back to some sort of semblance of normality eventually. Yeah.
Okay. Allison has a question. Allison's a landlord. It was mentioned earlier that we cannot stop people from moving in who are not on the lease. Is there a limit to that? If 2 people sign a lease and then move in 5 more people, can they do that? I was not given the option to run background checks on these extra tenants, nor was I given names. I live in a home as well. I'm having safety concerns.
Complicated stuff there, Allison. And it's probably worth it for you to talk to a landlord attorney, somebody like Kim Tennyson, who's been watching these sessions regularly. I'm not sure if she's on today or not. And Eric, if you don't mind putting Kim's website up in the chat box for her. The short answer though is maybe, maybe not. You might not be able to file an eviction. The eviction that one would normally file as a landlord in this situation would be an eviction against the tenant who you have a lease with, and then Jane Doe and John Doe, because you might not even know the names of the people that are living there. Those people did not take possession illegally, so they're not really trespassers. They're guests of the tenant. So maybe in normal times, you almost certainly would be able to file an eviction against the tenant, depending on how your lease is written on the lease, along with these other people. Right now, during the pandemic, I think it's hard to fit into the exceptions that we have. You can run this by, like I said, a landlord attorney, and we can recommend Kim. She knows what she's doing. But I can't guarantee you that that would be a winner in court right now during the pandemic. Having safety concerns is a lot different than seriously endangering others on the property, which a judge is almost certain to need more than just being concerned.
Another anonymous question. If a landlord files a conciliation court claim for rent owed, would the tenant still be able to redeem? Also, would the landlord be able to evict for the same amount when the peacetime emergency order and the CDC order are no longer in place?
Okay, leave that question on for a second, Eric, so I can make sure I'm following it. Redemption is a defense to an eviction. So it's not exactly a situation where a tenant would redeem. They can pay it off. They can pay off the debt. I mean, sometimes somebody gets sued in small claims court and they pay right away. And in fact, there are reasons to pay even after you lose if you pay quickly, because then it never gets entered as a judgment against somebody. I mean, the case was still filed, that's public record, but there's no judgment entered against you, which can have even if you pay it off, can have still some impact on credit. So if you lose in small claims court, and I think you get 20 or 30 days to appeal or pay, and if you pay during that time, it's got less of an impact on you long term. But redeeming isn't really the right word for defending a conciliation court claim or even settling up. That's really what you're doing, is you're settling what's owed. And the second part of the question, would the landlord be able to evict for the same amount when those things aren't in place? Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think a lot of landlords have just been running a bill, right? And the normal things that are allowed, rent, late fees, those are allowable charges for a landlord to tally up when they decide to either file an eviction for non-payment of rent or to sue in conciliation court for unpaid rent. Different phrasing. Again, an eviction court sole purpose is to figure out possession. Who gets the keys? That's really what it's about. Conciliation court is who owes what to who. We'll decide that. We'll make an official declaration of that, and then you can go try to collect once we've made that decision. But they're different courts with different goals. Conciliation court can only award money or personal property. So if somebody's got your bike and they never returned it, you can sue for the return of your bike, for instance. But real property doesn't work for that.
All right. Mary has a question or statement. Our local housing authority, public housing authority, is evicting for smoking in the unit, saying it's a serious safety issue. What's our opinion on that? They're also evicting for taking down smoke detectors, some still working, just not on the wall, some not working, again saying that's a serious safety issue.
Yeah, these are, I think, close calls. If the building has a no smoking policy throughout and tenants are smoking inside, and you've got neighbors that have medical conditions that make smoking especially problematic for them, asthma or something like that, I think it starts to get closer to seriously endangering others. That's what a judge is going to have to decide. If this goes to court, you're saying evicting, it might just be the landlord leaning on the tenant to leave or else, which is very different from an actual court case and a judge slamming down a gavel saying, yep, landlord, you're right. Same thing with the smoke detectors. Again, there's no big mystery, or maybe there is, about why tenants do that. It's not because they need the batteries. It's because they always squeak when they're trying to cook something and a little bit of smoke comes up. That's typically why people disengage the smoke detectors. Could that be a reason? I guess, yeah, that might be seriously endangering others. Maybe it's significant property damage. I'm not sure. I haven't seen those cases whether the landlord has won or lost the cases. We might even hear about that in our April 28th case. If a landlord has in fact filed for that, we'll point that out, the kind of thing that landlords are filing evictions for, and whether they're successful or not.
Okay. And then there was Wendy, just following up on when you were discussing the holdover question. On that, don't forget a landlord could sue a tenant who's holding over for any damages the landlord suffered as a result of the tenant not moving out when the tenant was had promised to move out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's kind of one of the downsides to doing this sort of rapid fire question and answer approach is you touch on trying to answer the main points of the question, and you might miss some of the details, where if somebody was calling us up as a tenant, we'd walk through a lot more of the potential permutations. But yeah, a tenant holds over and the landlord had been relying on their promise to leave. Yeah, I think a landlord might have a claim against the tenant. They'd have to show what their costs are. Clearly, they don't just get a windfall because of it. But let's say somehow this cost a landlord a sale, right, to some prospective buyer, and because the tenant didn't vacate, the landlord couldn't sell it, and they had planned on selling it. Would they have a claim against the tenant? In theory, yes, they would. Would they win the case? Maybe. And would they collect from the tenant? Again, that's a pretty big maybe as well. But still, it's possible. There might be additional claims that a landlord would have, what we refer to in the trade as consequential damages. As a consequence of what you did, I incurred these costs, and they never would have been incurred if you hadn't done that. And it would be a matter of proving those costs, that they aren't too speculative. But yeah, that's a possibility. It's a good point, Wendy. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna get out of class 3 minutes early, it looks
Did we
like
really
here.
get through all the questions?
Yeah. Well, at least for now. If you do have another question, go ahead and send it in. We can maybe take one more. Otherwise, we'll just again make the pitch for our seminar coming up in 2 weeks, where and again, maybe I'll put in the chat the recording of our last one. So it was in October of last year that both of these Homeline staff members, housing attorney Andrea Palumbo and U of M law student Leah DeGrazia, did a review of the evictions that had been filed thus far during the pandemic and the suspensions up through September or so, and did a review and highlighted some of the trends and the geographic trends and those things. So that this is going to be in 2 weeks, and they'll be covering a full year of the suspension as it did go into effect in January 24th or 25th of 2020. And so they've pulled a full year of eviction data statewide on that. We'll be applying for CLE, attorney CLE credit in Minnesota, 1.5 credits. And you can register in the link that was in the chat. And I don't see any other questions. Is there anything else we need to say?
Nope. Again, I am very excited about that session coming up in 2 weeks. It was one of the highlights of our sessions last year in my mind, and I'm sure it will be again this year. I know they're putting a lot of time into preparing for this and giving thorough and interesting reports on this once hopefully in a lifetime year that we've gone through, and plus we're a year plus at this point. But just having a full year's worth of data to look at and being able to compare it to the prior year, that kind of thing, just gives it a lot more firmness, because we all like to use annual reviews and things like that. So I'm very much looking forward to that presentation.
All right. Well, again, thank you for joining us today. And thanks again to our guest speaker, Sarah from Legalcore. And we shared some of the information about their upcoming clinics, and we'll include that with the recording and the slides on our website, and when we post that, and you'll get a follow-up email. So hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday, and thank you again for joining us.